Thank you, Julie. Thank you very much for the invitation to come along and tell you a bit about a project that Dave Valler and myself have, looking at Global Science Scapes and Transnational development. This is, I guess the image here is taken from a website which is on Oxford Brookes University web pages, so you can actually visit the website here and take a look at some of the places that we'll be studying, and there's further information on this project. The project is funded by Leverhulme Trust as an international network covering 6 different sort of localities, high-tech science spaces, so bringing together not just myself and Dave, but a number of academics internationally. And the title is Global Science Scapes, Dimensions of Transnationalism. To get money off of an organisation like Leverhulme, I think their criteria specify that we've got to be original or innovative. And of course there's a huge literature on science parks, a literature, for example, on how defined science parks help or hinder the economic performance of companies or new firm formation. There's also a distinct literature, I think, out there from practitioners and academics on things like the real estate offer that science parks have and can distinguish themselves from the rest of the urban property market scene. So the field is quite crowded in terms of literature and ideas, and in order to distinguish ourselves, we sort of latched onto this word here, scapes. Global Science Scapes, Global Science Landscapes, or technoscapes. I'll explain a little bit more about this in just a moment, where that idea comes from. Dave and myself are not scientists, we're social scientists, geographers and planners. But essentially the network is going to be looking at a series of different science spaces and examining in particular how global labour markets and knowledge flows associated with key scientists and knowledge workers interact with patterns of international diplomacy, that is, science spaces as projections of local and national economic development and modernity, and indeed ideas about science, architecture and planning or real estate in order to create distinctive science landscapes around the world. Okay, so how do these 3 things come together? And we're interested in trying to understand something of the distinctiveness and diversity of science spaces. We probably have in our mind a particular view of what a typical science space is, and I'll say more about this in just a moment. Somewhere which is imageable, identifiable, perhaps quite well defined, and there are certainly some places which act as perhaps models, even though they are perhaps rather unique and particular. So we're interested in the diversity of these places, some of which are extremely large, whole urban regions, some of which are actually rather small, defined spaces at the edge of town, perhaps. The idea that we're working with comes from a person, Arjan Appadurai, who is, I guess, a cultural anthropologist, so not an immediately obvious starting point, but he certainly is interested in thinking about the global economy, not just in terms of economic flows which bind together different national territories or different localities, but also in terms of cultural flows. So he's interpreting very much the process of globalization in cultural economic terms. And he basically draws upon this idea of the metaphor of a landscape. Okay, that in other words, the global cultural economy is made up of a series of intertwining and shifting landscapes. Okay, so scapes. In particular, he identifies 5 different landscapes, global landscapes, if you like. Some of these are probably quite familiar. We're pretty familiar with the fact that the world is integrated these days through global flows of finance. This has almost become a kind of commonplace. I guess we're becoming associated with the fact that the media penetrates everywhere. I've managed to keep myself off of YouTube successfully until this moment, and now I find that I'm being filmed and recorded. So there's no escape from the media anywhere, including here. The three that we were interested in are obviously picking up on this idea here that we can think about science parks, technology parks, science spaces as part of a landscape of technology, a landscape of science, if you like. Technology in its widest sense, embodied in buildings, equipment, facilities, etc., as well as patents, etc. But we're also interested in how these technoscapes are really partly shaped through ideas and through movements of people, key labour, scientific labour perhaps. So Aperture talks about ethnoscapes. Again, something we're becoming more familiar with after a period when the global economy was actually rather closed or partitioned into national economies with relatively little movement of people across national borders. We're now very aware of migration flows, politically, given the current sort of election as well. It's a key issue there. But thinking about the role that these key movements of people play in the efficacy of science spaces, particular science parks or technology parks. And we'll come back to this in a moment. But also thinking, interestingly, about how science is imageable, how images around science spaces are mobilized to project local and national territories and project messages regarding economic development. And of course, like any good landscape, a lot depends on where you're viewing things from. Your perspective of the landscape can vary. So in terms of these global flows, some are more global than others, let's say. Finance is certainly pretty global these days, but ideas are often quite restricted in terms of the way in which they're received in different parts of the world. So maybe there are some of these scapes which are more partitioned at a regional scale than others. So we're interested in the way in which these shifting landscapes and the actors that come to sort of imagine them are actually important in fashioning science spaces. So we have a series of actors, city governments, institutes, key scientists, etc., who come together collectively, I suppose, to imagine and create new social realities, new sort of science spaces, if you like. And I guess the interesting angle we're trying to play upon here is that transnationalism, transnational flows are important to understanding science spaces, and in particular their prospects for success. So thinking in terms not just of science spaces as rather parochial spaces, enclaves of local capacities. I guess one of the implications of this is that some of these flows can be mobilized for local economic development. So I just want to pick up on those three sort of scapes, if you like, the technoscape idea, the ideascapes, and the ethnoscapes idea. Well, probably if there is a model out there in terms of a science space, it has been summarized under this sort of label here. This is a label that Anne Forsyth has used, that many science spaces are sort of captured in this dominant thought of there being an international campus, garden, suburb model. Louise Mozingo has written a book recently about pastoral capitalism, the rise of corporate campuses from as early as the 1920s and 30s, the idea that companies would take particular parts of their activities and not exactly hide them away, but certainly create particular landscapes in which research and development activity would take place. And of course, science parks, technology parks are kind of collective versions of that in a sense. So what do we have in mind in terms of that model? Well, international, leaving aside this particular sort of set of housing arrangements here, which are definitely rather particular to Korea in this case, or East Asia perhaps. Some of these images could probably take place more or less anywhere. There's a certain genericness about some of these landscapes. This happens to be one, Daedeokinopolis in South Korea, I think it's about 2 hours outside of Seoul by train, a particular sort of landscaped garden suburban city created specifically to house a whole range of research institutes and foster scientific activity within the Korean economy. But we've got some of those ingredients here. Like I say, it could be perhaps anywhere. It's fairly international in its looks. It's certainly quite landscaped with things like gardens and ponds. It also happens to be quite clearly demarcated as a particular territory, a particular zone in which there are, various incentives and the like on offer. And it's also planned as an integrated whole. So although the housing looks particular to East Asia, of course it is a place that's planned with key infrastructure and housing in place. So if we have an image, we probably have an image of this kind of campus suburban format. Interestingly, Peter Hall and Manuel Castells noted quite a long time ago that although these were typically the kinds of spaces that were being planned for scientific activity and the knowledge economy, actually cities remained the most important locations for invention and innovation. And so we've had something of a recent revisit of this whole idea. I think you can probably say that, some of the policy in the UK context, science cities, some of the celebration of the city by people like Ed Glazer have kind of opened up this whole question about whether really scientific activity is best served by it being sequestered away into particular suburban campuses, or whether it's best integrated as part of the urban economy. So in other words, should really, we'd be interested in actually quite a wide variety of physical forms. Dave is going to talk a bit about Science Vale in the UK, and Science Vale is not even suburban, it's essentially rural in its situation. That creates all kinds of challenges in terms of infrastructure and housing needs, if you like. The second idea maybe is sort of slightly less familiar with, in terms of the practitioner and academic literature on science parks and technology parks, but it's clear that some of these spaces can act as international diplomacy and have been projected in these ways. You don't even need to be successful to act as an international model. Malaysia's multimedia super corridor, I don't think anyone would say that's a dramatic success in terms of stimulating indigenous companies, IT companies. That was certainly the aim. It's been a vehicle for attracting in foreign investment in the first place, with the idea of stimulating local entrepreneurs in terms of IT and software, etc. But it's been, I would say, probably largely a bit of a failure in those terms. That hasn't stopped it from being copied in places like India. So politicians looking enviously at a particular key sort of image of Malaysia's economic modernity. The multimedia super corridor was really Malaysia's attempt to create a Silicon Valley and assist in the structural transformation of the Malaysian economy from an industrial to a knowledge economy. So this is India's version of it in Hyderabad. This is Cyberabad Development Authority. The development of particular purpose, authorities in order to drive through some of these key developments. A place like Singapore, very influential within the East Asian context. Many of Singapore's government-linked companies are involved with things like real estate, design, conception, management, etc. And that includes companies like Ascendas, who have been very influential in developing new science spaces and buildings across East Asia. Finally, the other theme that we can think of in terms of landscapes is the whole idea of science spaces being woven together increasingly through so-called ethnoscapes, that is, movements of key workers, scientific labour. The classic example here, written about by Annelies Saxenian, is the kind of reciprocal linkages between a place like Silicon Valley and flows of PhD students from places like Taiwan, flowing into Silicon Valley, training up in Stanford, etc., setting up companies initially perhaps in the US, then returning back to Taiwan, but retaining some of those linkages and collaborations. Perhaps a more simple way of thinking about this is Richard Florida's idea of the creative class or the knowledge class. So important to think about how local science spaces mobilize migrant flows of highly skilled labor, let's say. And again, this relates back to the point about the physical and real estate offer that science spaces are. Are they places to be sheltered away, self-contained, or are they increasingly to be integrated into a larger, more cosmopolitan urban economy? So the basic aim of the project then is to think about how interacting flows of ideas about architecture and the built environment, the real estate offer, how that meshes with a global political economy or diplomacy effect, the idea of governments and actors being able to project these spaces internationally, whether it's to skilled labour or inward investors, and how labour itself perceives these places, because these are key people in the scientific endeavour. So these are just the aims here. You can see that there are 3 research objects which fit with these 3 different landscapes, if you like, at an international level. These are the 6 places that are part of the study. Dave is going to follow on right now and talk a bit about Science Vale UK. This is the kind of UK case study we're looking at. Like I say, a very particular kind of place. But we've got Daedalus in South Korea. We are hoping to look at Silicon Valley through one of our collaborators, a place called Kennis Park in the Netherlands, Hsinchu Science Park, which is quite famous in Taiwan, and also Singapore, which has this significant diplomacy role, I think, within East Asia. And potentially, through Julie's work, perhaps a Chinese case study could be Zhongguancun or Optical Valley in Wuhan. I think at this point, I'll hand over to Dave.